Well, we're just getting set up in Iowa here on Okoboji. We're back in Iowa. And so I had to come down here for a seminar at there's a really cool fishing club down here, Iowa Great Lakes Fishing Club. And so they have an annual meeting, came down here, speak at that, and then figured, well, I'm down here, I got to stop by Okoboji here. And so we're just getting set up here, just looking around. I've got the pole down, just trying to look for weeds and look for fish. Been a few years since I've been down here, so excited to be back. We're fishing with a couple of fishing fanatics that spend a lot of time down here, and they also produce a pretty popular podcast here in the upper Midwest here, Midwest Anglers Podcast. Should be a good time.
We're out here on Okoboji today, West Lake Okoboji, tucked into a bay, searching for bluegills. Got enough of us guys around that we're just kind of spreading around, and hopefully one of us keys in on something and the rest of us can kind of come in and really focus on that area. Once you can find where some active hungry schools are, normally you can make the bite happen.
You know, so we're looking for big bluegills today, and this lake has got some really impressive fish. And basically we're just in a bay. And if you can imagine, there's weeds growing all across this bay, you know, just clumpy weeds. And so right away, you know, put the forward-facing sonar in the water and just scan around with the active target. My favorite thing in a situation like this, look around, see if you can find some fish and some weeds. Look for that tall clump of weeds and just set up on it. I just find that those weed spots recharge, and they change from year to year.
It seems like on West Lake Okoboji in particular, the west side of the lake has always been a little bit better. It's got a lot more bays and a lot more areas to tuck into. And really, you got to get into these bays, find where that weed line drops to a smooth bottom, and get set up right along that weed line. Those fish are moving along those weeds, and the bigger bluegill tend to come out away from the weeds a little bit more. When you're out there, that's where you're going to catch the bigger bluegill.
Oh yeah, nice bluegill. Oh, these fish are just thick. Look at that. I mean, just look how broad they are across the back. Beautiful looking fish. Right in the beak. You know, and these Okoboji bluegills are just like I remember them. I mean, they can be fussy. You have to put in your work to catch nice fish, but there's some big fish here. But one thing that's really apparent is it's like you get one chance at these fish. They come in, that cadence on that jig has got to be just perfect. And if you screw it up, it's like they just do not come back. They just come up and they pedal away.
And if you notice, that fish had a really yellowish pale color to it. We moved in a little bit shallower here because we weren't really finding the fish deeper like we were earlier. And the water is a lot murkier here. It was a little bit clearer out there. And you tend to see that that murky water gets to be a little bit more pale fish. In the clear water, the fish's color is a little bit more vibrant.
So here's something to share, as far as catching bluegills that require finesse. People talk about rods and all this different stuff as far as sensitivity and trying to catch a light biting fish. In my opinion, changing line or having new line is one of the most important components to your presentation, in the sense that you're using 1 pound test, 2 pound test, 3 pound test. You're using that light mono. If you're developing any twist in that line and that jig spins when you're just quivering it and it's turning a lot, these big bluegills don't want nothing to do with it, okay? And so when you're reeling in a fish that fights, it's swimming in a circle every time you reel it in, you're twisting up your line. It doesn't matter if you're using a spinning reel or a spooler reel, it doesn't matter. At some point, you're gonna build up twist in your line. And so it's probably a big thing that's really underrated, is change your line often. I would rather have new line on my rod and reel and be changing line every week versus having say a $200 fishing rod and year-old line. Okay, it's amazing how one of the most important things people skimp on. If you're gonna spend money on your line and run it on a cheap rod versus having an expensive rod and having junk line on your reel. It's such a major difference, such a major factor when it comes to your presentation, when it's really boils down to finesse.
So the Iowa Great Lakes region here is really a unique thing. It's a bunch of lakes right in the middle of a bunch of cornfields. The biggest lake is the farthest north, that's Spirit Lake, and Spirit Lake drains down into the top of East Okoboji. Farthest west is West Okoboji. It's the deepest lake of all of them, getting well over 100 feet. And West Okoboji actually drains down into East Okoboji also. Then the chain goes farther down into Upper Gar, Mini Washta, and then Lower Gar until it goes out of a spillway and down into a river. Here we go.
There we go, look at there. That's a big hen. Look at that. These are just quality bluegills, and it always amazes me. You come out here, you look at a map of Iowa, there's not a lot of water. And so, it's probably pretty easy to just assume that these lakes, get plenty of fishing pressure, plenty of people out here fishing, but over and over, I've been impressed by the bluegills and the crappies and the bass that you can catch in northern Iowa. There she goes. And this is notoriously a brain surgery finesse bite. A lot of times when I've been down here in the past, it's 1 pound test. It's tiny, tiny teardrop jigs or marmuska horizontal jigs, or now we're using tungsten jigs. But notoriously, these fish can be difficult to catch in the sense it does take the right gear. And so the word this year is that with all the flooding that was happening in northern Iowa this spring, this water's got just a touch more color, where a lot of years we'd be sight fishing. So right now we're in 12 feet of water, just fishing these scattered weed clumps that are through this bay. And water's just a touch too dirty to sight fish. And so I'm using 2 pound test, but I've been down here some years with really clear water where, you got to use 1 pound test to get bit. And so it's notoriously a bite where you have to use finesse, but there are some beautiful panfish in this area.
When it comes to fishing Okoboji in general and chasing panfish, one of the things I like to do is downsize my jig pretty small, tip that with a wax worm or a small plastic, and use a 1 to 2 pound line, just because these fish here can be very finicky and tough to catch sometimes. Got this nice pumpkin seed here. These things just have beautiful, beautiful color on them. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get them back down to the hole. All right, we got the winds blowing today, 40 mile an hour gusts. We had to move the pickups back here behind us to be able to block some of the wind. Being able to see the bite and detect the bite's pretty tough with the wind today, so we're just doing what we can.
You know, so this is such a finesse game down here, and you know, we're using anywhere from 1 to 3 pound test, and so this is just 2 pound frost mono. The water really clears up. Definitely drop down to 1 pound test. If you can get away with 2 or 3 pound test, do it. But I would dare guess that most days out here, you're probably not going to catch many bluegills with, say, 4 pound test. It's just too heavy. And so we're using a lot of spring bobbers and just real small tungsten jigs. See how small that jig is in my hand? I mean, just tiny jigs. The spring bobber is important on a lot of these bites, just to quiver that jig and also for the bite detection. And I'm a big fan of these Spooler Elite reels, just because I like to pull the line out and I feel like it straightens the line, and so slows down the drop, keeps your line straight. This is just a 27-inch straight drop spring bobber made by Clam, which you could probably get as good of a rod or better if you spend 200 bucks on a custom rod. But as far as just a commercially made rod that's affordable, to me this is one of the best bluegill rods out there, bar none. This other rod here is just a noodle rod. Again, same 2 pound test. Switched up to a Wonder Bread jig on this one, but they're just a real soft tip. And again, when you're doing that quiver, that cadence is like, these fish don't give you a second chance. These fish just slowly come in. If you change or alter your quiver at all, it just seems like these fish just back off. And one thing to note is that you use a spring bobber rod or a noodle rod, you do the same quiver, both the jigs are going to look differently in the water. And so I find that with that glass tip on the noodle rod, just a nice hard pound just gives that jig a little bit more pop, which sometimes calls fish in better. Whereas the spring bobber, it just subdues the motion on that jig, where you do that same pound on that spring bobber and it just kind of floats that jig a little more. And so basically you can change your presentation dramatically by just changing your spring bobber or changing your rod tip. You know, that's just how technical this fishing can be down here, in the sense you're just trying to find that right cadence on the rod tip and the line and the jig, just trying to see what those fish want. Here we go. Here we go. Oh, look at that. Fun stuff. That's just a size 14 tungsten. See how little that is? And I can tell you what, I started off with some bigger stuff. I couldn't even get these fish to look at it. So definitely small profiles have been kind of the program. All right, we'll get her back. Yeah, these are just quality sunfish. See there, I'm using a 7.5-inch cage reel just for dropping forward-facing sonar down when we're trying to find these spots. You know, you get these fish that are 1 inch or more longer than a 7.5-inch hole. I mean, those are quality bluegills. So you can see that it's tiny little drop. That's a tungsten. And what I've been doing is tying a snell knot, because these eyelets get so small, then that just causes that jig to hang fairly horizontal. And this is important here. I've been just running 1 waxworm. And on a really tough bite, I'm basically just running that hook through towards the head of the waxworm 1 time. Then what I'm doing is I'm squishing that waxworm just to get the juice to pop out of it. But then that waxworm really flops. It's got a really delicate action where it just kind of flutters, and it puts a lot of scent in the water. On a really tough bluegill bite, to me, that is about as deadly as it gets.
I basically cut my teeth fishing Okoboji. My grandpa actually had a place up on the north end of West Lake Okoboji, and so we would sight fish bluegills off the dock. And so when I learned about ice fishing, and my brother and I went out into the bays and would hand auger holes, and we had an old suitcase style shack, and you know, sitting in 5 foot of water in the weeds, you know, watching these fish come through. And I think it really made me a better angler, understanding what the fish were doing and the way that they reacted to our presentations. And another pumpkin seed here. We've been catching a lot of these today. Beautiful, beautiful fish. Almost looks like it belongs in salt water. We're fishing weed edge here. We figured out there's a pretty hard line where these fish are kind of roaming. They're going through the weeds. We're sitting right on the side of it, and a lot of fish just passing through, and we're slowly but surely picking them off.
When you look at Lake Okoboji, it's probably easy to dismiss a lake like this because you look around the lake and it's just so developed. There's just beautiful homes, cabins, development all around the lake. And you think, boy, there's just so many people. And there probably is all kinds of recreational activity in the summertime, but you come out here in the winter and it feels like a ghost town. There's nobody in these homes, there's nobody on the lake, just a handful of ice anglers. And this place has always had almost a mystical quality about it when you look at the big bluegills. I mean, this is one of those places that, as far as catching legitimate 10-inch fish, this is a place where it can happen. There we go. Oh yeah, look at this. There we go, there's a nice bluegill. That's a nice fish, look at that. All perked up. Oh yeah, look at that. See there, that's a male there. You see there's just the big ear tabs and just a little bit deeper chest. Usually they're orange or pink on the chest. And this wind is probably blowing 35, 40 miles an hour. But you know what? Hunker down in a fish house, hunker down on a weed clump like we're doing. It's still a great way to spend a winter day.
So the podcast started back in 2018, where my friend Matt and I were going to start a podcast, like, you know what, the Midwest Angler Podcast, that's what we'll call it. And yeah, the first one we rolled November of 2018. So wow, we've been going for over 5 years now, close to 300 episodes. You can find it at the Midwest Angler Podcast on Facebook and anywhere you look for podcasts.
Scott called me up one day and said, hey, how do you feel about doing a podcast? And I said, you know what, it sounds like a pretty good idea. I think I could be down for that. And he said, well, I bought the equipment already. It's on its way, so we're going to start one anyways. So that's how it started out, and it's always a lot of fun. One thing we pride ourselves on is we're hard on our gear all the time whenever we go out fishing. I mean, you hear people always throw that term around, nobody's harder on their gear than we are. Especially during the ice season. Everything gets frozen up, you're throwing things in the back of vehicles and going to different spots around the country.
There we go. Oh, golly, do you love that? Look at how these fish dig. Oh, slide that one out. Look at that. That is a gill. That's a beauty. Oh, you almost have to reach down and grab each one because light line wants to break. But these fish, I mean, they can be tough to catch. A lot of times you're dealing with clear water, just dealing with high pressure. But I mean, look at the thickness of that fish. I mean, that's just a beautiful bluegill, but no doubt Okoboji has a certain mystique. And it's like, just from what we're seeing today, it's like you get one chance of these fish when they come in. If it's not perfect, if they don't eat it relatively quickly, you don't get a lot of opportunities. But these are quality fish. Wow, look at that. There she goes. Oh. And every time we do a bluegill episode, especially targeting big bluegills, we always try to touch on the conservation. It's pretty interesting, some of the information that we're learning about bluegills. And the thing about bluegills, I mean, they're such a good eating fish. I mean, in my opinion, bluegills are like the best eating fish in the upper Midwest here that we have. And with that being said, you take like a 6 to 8 inch bluegill, to me, that's just a perfect eater. But those big males especially, 9, 10 inch fish, the males guard the nest, and the males are the ones that pass on their genetics. And so if you don't protect those big bulls, what happens is those smaller males that sexually mature at a younger, smaller age start to take over, and those fish pass on their genetics, and pretty soon you end up with a bunch of stunted fish. And so it's really important, with bluegills especially, selective harvest. A 10-inch bluegill on most water, that's probably a 10-year-old fish, and so these big bluegills are pretty special. You know, if you want a challenge, try catching a 10-inch bluegill, try catching a 9-inch bluegill with 1 pound test in a weed bed. You know, these fish, they're off to the races. I often joke that if a bluegill grew to the size of a garbage can lid, you'd never be able to reel them in. I mean, that's just how much horsepower and how much fight these fish have. It's just, there's just such a fun fish to catch. Oh. Look at that. These fish will break your line. Look at that. That is just gorgeous. They just have such a nice build on them. They're just thick fish. I think that's the thing, you know, you look at the bluegills and crappies, you know, I think they grow pretty fast in this part of the world.